And as our children are leaving, if you have your Bibles, you can look up in your Bibles 1 Samuel chapter 17. For the past few weeks, if you've been with us, we've been going through a series on the life of David, and I've entitled the series Secrets of Success. There are so many points that I could make from these passages, but I'm just trying to highlight a few. If you remember one thing that is kind of overarching when it comes to success, success in God's eyes looks different than success in the world's eyes. Success is dangerous. It's when you are most successful that you are susceptible probably to the greatest temptations. We also said that success comes from failure. And one of the phrases I've used also is success as a servant. So those are just a few of the things that we've looked at the past couple of weeks. Last week, sorry, that success arises from God, that God raises up people, that God raises up success. Today we're going to look at 1 Samuel chapter 17. We're going to look at the entire chapter, verses 1 to 58. It's a story that most of you probably know. Even for people who aren't Christian, this may be a story that they know. I said this last week, but a few weeks ago I was tempted to maybe skip over this story because I thought, well, you've heard it so many times. You know the story, and would it be repetitive to go over this passage again? But then I was really convicted that sometimes it's the stories that we think we know the best are the stories we really don't know. It's always dangerous to assume that you know something, because in assuming that you know it, you actually may not know it. And so we're going to look at this story. It's a long story, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give a commentary as we go. We're going to read a few verses at a time, and then I'm going to explain kind of the significance of those verses. So we're going to go section by section. And I want to ask you to try and do this. If you can try and read this story like you've never heard it before. Pretend that you've never, if you could, because I think one of the reasons we're not amazed by this story, and I have been amazed anew by this story in the past few weeks. But I think the reason and the way that I've been amazed is by trying to read this story like I've never heard it before. And I think if this is the first time you've heard this story, it will sound even more amazing. And so we'll start here in 1 Samuel chapter 17, verses 1 to 58. This is the Word of God. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle. Hey, Wano, can I get that map? So you can see on the map that the land of the Philistines borders the land of Israel. And the Philistines, they were gathered at Soko, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Soko and Azekah in Ephes Damim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in line of battle against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. So we'll stop there before we move on. So these few verses, they just give us the setting of the story. There are two countries going to war, the Philistines and the Israelites, and they're fighting in the valley of Elah. If the Philistines win this battle, they'll have a free road into all of Judah. So this is a very important valley because it's a very important road or a route into the land of Judah. And so the battle takes place in the valley of Elah. The Philistines are on one hill or on one mountain on one side of the valley, and the Israelites are on the other hill or other mountain on the other side of the valley. So there's a battle taking place. We don't know much about the battle, but it's just a normal battle up to this point. There's nothing that the Philistines are too worried about, and there's nothing that the Israelites are too worried about yet. right? So this sets up the scene. In these next few verses, we're going to see the problem that arises. Up to this point in the story, the Israelites aren't too worried about the Philistines. The problem will arise in these next few verses. And in this next section that we're going to read, the author is going to introduce the two main characters of this story, the Philistine champion, Goliath, and the Israelite, David. So verse 4, we're going to introduce the main characters of the story. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span, about 9 feet, 9 inches. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. That's about 125 pounds of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs, and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. That's about 15 pounds. And his shield bearer went before him. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? And are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistine said, "I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now David was the son of an Ephrathite of Bethlehem in Judah, named Jesse, who had 8 sons. In the days of Saul, the man was already old and advanced in years. The 3 oldest sons of Jesse had followed Saul to the battle. And the names of his 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab, the firstborn, and next to him, Abinadab, and the third, Shammah. David was the youngest, or the smallest. The 3 eldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. I'm going to pause right there. So the author introduces these 2 main characters, Goliath of Gath. He's an intimidating figure. And I think the author is trying to emphasize how intimidating of a figure Goliath is. He's a man who's about 9 feet, 9 inches tall, and he's covered in the best armor. And he's covered from head to toe. He has a helmet of bronze on his head. He has a coat of mail around his body. He has bronze over his legs. He has a javelin and a spear, and he has a shield bearer. I mean, I think the author is trying to highlight the bigger, just the intimidating figure that he is. Bronze, almost everything that covers or that is on Goliath is made of bronze. And bronze is the best metal of this time. They were just starting to enter into the Iron Age. The only thing that's made of iron is the tip of Goliath's spear. And so, again, if you're reading this story for the first time, if you've never heard this story, and it's really hard for us to imagine this, but you've probably never seen a person that fits this description. Larger than life figure, very intimidating. And then the author introduces the next main character in David. And if you compare the two, if one is really intimidating, then David would be less than intimidating. There's nothing intimidating about David. We're told about David, we're told that he has three older brothers. He actually has 7. But the 3 oldest must be pretty impressive. If you were with us a couple of weeks ago, we were already introduced to these 3 brothers, Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah. And we're told that these 3 brothers, that they are the ones that follow Saul out to battle. None of the other brothers, and not even David. And it's probably because these 3 thought that they had the most to contribute. They probably were the tallest, the strongest, the most skilled at war. And when you read this story, it's almost assumed that David would not go out to battle because he's the youngest. But the Hebrew word there for youngest, you can also translate it smallest, or the most incapable of all of the brothers. He's the youngest, he's the smallest. Nobody expects him to go out and follow Saul into battle. And so we're told that David, he's introduced just as the youngest. And the author doesn't really tell us much about him. There's no sense from what we've read thus far that he would be this great warrior. And so these are the 2 main characters of the story. And then we're going to get into the story here. We're going to start at verse 16. So now that we know the background of the story, for 40 days, the Philistine Goliath came forward and took his stand morning and evening. Before David even gets there, for 40 days, the Philistine champion does this. Verse 17, and Jesse said to David his son, take for your brothers an ephah of this parched grain, about 9 gallons of parched grain, and these 10 loaves, and carry them quickly to the camp to your brothers. Also take these 10 cheeses to the commander of their 1,000. See if your brothers are well, and bring some token from them. We're already told that Jesse, David's father, is advanced in years. He's an old man. And you get the sense from this part of the story that he's worried. He's worried about his 3 oldest sons. And that's why he sends them not only food, but he tells David, bring some token from them. Proof that they're okay. Proof that they're still alive. See, I don't know if you've thought about this, but this battle has been going on for 40 days. It's taking place in the land of Judah. I think that rumors have started to spread about this battle between Israel and the Philistines. And I think the rumor has started to go around that the battle's not going very well. I think people have heard about this Philistine champion, Goliath, and this challenge that he's presented to the Israelites. Jesse, David's father, seems to know that the battle is not going well. And like any parent, he's worried. He's worried about his children. He wants his 3 sons to be in the best condition, to be in the best shape to fight in this battle. And so he tells his youngest son, go and just be a messenger. Take this grain and this bread, and just so that the officers, look favorably upon your brothers, take these cheeses to them too. But again, go see if they're well. And you need to bring back a token. Bring back a token from them. Verse 19. Now Saul and they, David's 3 brothers, and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah, fighting with the Philistines. And David rose early in the morning and left the sheep with the keeper and took the provisions and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the encampment as the host, or the army of Israel, was going out to the battle line, shouting the war cry. And Israel and the Philistines drew up for battle, army against army. And David left the things in charge of the keeper of the baggage and ran to the ranks and went and greeted his brothers. As he talked with them, behold, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came up out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before. And David heard him. All the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were much afraid. And the men of Israel said, "Have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. Oh, and the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and will make his father's house free in Israel." And David said to the men who stood by him, "What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God?" And the people answered him in the same way, "So shall it be done to the man who kills him." Before we move on to this next part, it's just important that you realize, again, this battle is not going well. Okay, the Israelites are not winning this battle. And one of the things that caught my attention is verse 20. This story starts in verse 20. Everything else is kind of a background information to the story of David and Goliath. But in verse 20, we're told, "And David rose early in the morning." This is just another normal morning for David. It's just another day. All of us, we get up in the morning and we think to ourselves, it's just another day. It's a normal day. This was just a regular day for David. And David had no idea that this day was going to change his life. And I find that interesting because I don't know if we enter our days with expectation, I wonder if God is going to do something great today. But again, David has no idea what's about to happen. Now, most of us know what's about to happen. But don't you think it's interesting that David has no idea that this day, which starts out like any other day, that this day is going to be the most important day of his life, perhaps, and a great day for him. This next section, David is going to have a conversation with his older brother, Eliab. David is also going to have a conversation with King Saul. And then later we're going to find that David has another conversation with the Philistine champion, Goliath. And all of them, if you listen carefully, they don't think that David is capable of fighting the Philistine. Okay? And we're going to see this, that David is not an intimidating figure. He doesn't seem to be qualified to fight this Philistine champion. So in verse 28, now Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men. And Eliab's anger was kindled against David. And he said, "Why have you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle." And David said, "What have I done now? Was it not but a word?" So you hear what David's brother is saying. David's not capable of doing anything. He's not capable of being a soldier in this army. And if you heard it in the middle of it, this is what he says to kind of jab David. And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? David, the only thing you're good for is watching sheep. And even that, not even a lot of sheep. Who'd you leave those few sheep with? David, you're worthless. You can't do anything. What are you doing here? Okay, that's who David is. That's who his brothers see him as. In verse 30, and David turned away from his brother toward another, and he spoke in the same way. And the people answered him again as before. When the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. Now remember, Saul knows who David is, because David had come into Saul's service in his court playing the lyre. And David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. And Saul said to David, you are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant used to keep sheep for his father. And when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. And David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. Then Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a helmet of bronze on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. And David strapped his sword over his armor. And he tried in vain to go, for he had not tested them. Then David said to Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them. So David put them off. Then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in the shepherd's pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. And the Philistine moved forward and came near to David with his shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his God. The Philistine said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field. Then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves, not with a sword and spear. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. And so, again, if you picture this in your mind, if you picture this story in your mind, when you see David meeting Goliath, what you would see in your mind is this larger-than-life, intimidating figure coming up to this very unimpressive, small boy. And again, these three individuals, David's oldest brother, King Saul, and Goliath of Gath, they both don't see anything in this young man, David, that would convince them that he would be able to fight the Philistine. But if anything, when you hear David speak, you have to be impressed. As unintimidating and as small as he is, his words are larger than life. His words are intimidating. I find it interesting that Goliath says to David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with a stick?" Listen to everything that David says to Goliath. In verse 46, "This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head." If Goliath is a dog and David has a stick, he's like poking the dog with this stick. Basically, I mean, he's making Goliath even more angry. Basically just poking this guy with a stick, saying, "I'm going to cut off your head." And if that's not bad enough, "And I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air, to the wild beasts of the field, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel." And so the more David talks, the more he's just making Goliath even more upset. I mean, he just picture Goliath, and at first it's a joke. At first Goliath is looking at David, and he sees this as a complete joke. But the more David talks, his words are impressive, but they're just annoying this Philistine champion. And the more David talks, the more upset this champion becomes. And by the time David's done talking, Goliath is just ready to take care of this little boy. Right? Can you imagine if just after being insulted, we get to the battle. In verse 48, we're told, "When the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David," things don't look very good. Again, we know the ending of the story, but if you don't know the ending of the story, this little boy just bit off a whole lot more than he could chew. He just made this Philistine champion really upset. This is not looking very good here. "When the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it." I'm going to pause there. I just want to explain to you what it is that David does here. When I first read this story, I thought that I kind of imagined to myself, how does this rock sink into Goliath's forehead, and how does this rock make Goliath collapse and fall to the ground? So I did some more research. Pastor Mike and I were talking about this last week, but we learned that a sling isn't just like a boy toy. So for us these days, when we think of a sling, we just think of it as a toy, as something that kids use for amusement. But back in David's time, a sling was an actual weapon of war. And they likened it to archery. They likened it to a bow and arrow. And they actually said that a sling is more accurate than an archer's arrow. And you could actually throw a sling stone. The farthest distance that you could sling a sling stone is 400 yards. That's today's big football day. That's 100 yards. We're talking 4 football fields. And the longer the sling is, right, the farther it'll go. And so the sling is basically one long rope. In the middle, there's a pouch that holds the stone. The longer the rope is, the farther the rock will go. The farther the sling stone will go. You would attach one end of the string to your finger, and you'd hold the other end with your finger. And basically, it's like a softball motion. It would just be one swing, and you would let the end go, and it would fly. You wouldn't do that. It would just be one swing, and they would throw it. And the research that I've done is these slings are extremely accurate. They actually said that they're more accurate than bow and arrows. And so it's not surprising that David would be able to hit Goliath on the head from whatever distance, because it's a real instrument of war. The one thing that I didn't realize is how big the sling stone would be. When I thought of a sling, I thought the stone would be like this big, right? And so I imagined a stone this big. And in my head, I'm like, how can a stone this big make that giant fall to the ground? I don't know. God can do anything. But then I realized that the stone, every country, they would use a different size stone. And so the Greeks, they would use stones that are sized about the golf ball. But not the Israelites. If you look at archaeological evidence, the sling stones that the Israelites used, they were sized anywhere from a billiard ball to a tennis ball. That's a big stone, right? So a billiard ball, a pool ball, right? Ranging as big as a tennis ball. And so that's a big stone. That's a big stone in this sling. And it makes sense to me how that would cause the giant to fall. And based on the research they've done, this sling stone, the speed that it would leave the sling at is at 60 miles per hour. And so this is not just some boyhood toy, and it's not kind of unrealistic that this would happen. It's a real weapon of war, and it's a really big stone. And again, obviously David had been practicing. This takes great practice, and so I just kind of want to give you some background and some information about the sling and the stone. The last thing that you'd want to know, and this makes sense to any of you science people, but David would have to carefully choose the 5 stones. Because what would happen if your stones were different weight and different size? Then you would have to change how hard or how soft you threw it. Whenever you're throwing something, you want it to be the same size. And you want it to be as round as possible, so there's no left and right, up and down motion. You want it to be as round as possible, and again, you want it to be about the same size. Whenever David has practiced his sling, he's always used stones that are about the same size. So David's practiced this. He's practiced this sling, and he's used stones that are all around the same size. So David's done this before. And it's with this sling and with this stone that David hits Goliath on the forehead. And from my interpretation, the stone on the forehead makes Goliath fall to the ground. But what ultimately kills Goliath is, we're told that David takes out his sword and kills him and cuts off his head. So we're going to finish the story at second half of verse 51. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. And the men of Israel and Judah rose with a shout and pursued the Philistines as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron, so that the wounded Philistines fell on the way, far from Sha'arayim, as far as Gath and Ekron. And the people of Israel came back from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their camp. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem. But he put his armor in this tent. I'm convinced that if you told this story to anybody for the first time, the ending of this story would be amazing. If you showed this Bible story on a video and you showed it to a group of people who have never heard this story, this ending is amazing. This may be the most greatest victory in the history of humanity. When it comes to a military battle and a military victory, I mean, it's so unlikely. Again, we're not so amazed by the victory because we're used to it and we know the story. But it's so unlikely. The Israelites, for 40 days, they weren't going anywhere in this battle. And all of a sudden, this nobody, this boy who nobody believed in, defeats this champion. What's interesting to me about this story is this is not where the story ends. I always thought that this is where the story ended. If somebody asked you, can you tell me the story of David and Goliath? How would you end the story? Most of you would end the story right here. But that's not where this story ends in 1 Samuel chapter 17. And I find that really interesting. Because normally when you're telling the story, the way you end the story is the way you summarize it. It's the way you're ending it. You're coming to a point. And the point of the story is found at the end of the story. And this is why I say, a lot of us, we think we know this story. But if you didn't know that the story of David and Goliath ended with David having a conversation with Saul, then maybe you don't know the story as well as you thought you did. And maybe you don't realize why it's included in the Bible. So we're going to read these last few verses, and this is how the story of David and Goliath ends. As soon as Saul saw David go out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, Abner, whose son is this youth? And Abner said, as your soul lives, O king, I do not know. And the king said, inquire whose son the boy is. And as soon as David returned from the striking down of the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, whose son are you, young man? And David answered, I am the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite. I find that ending so intriguing. This is why. First of all, does Saul know David or not? Saul knows David. So this is not a question of, I don't know you. What's really interesting to me about the story is Saul doesn't ask the question that I would have asked. You would think the question is, boy, who are you? Even if you know somebody, right? When somebody does something extraordinary, right, and you're amazed by what they do, you'll be like, who are you? Right? So Saul knows David because David, it works in his court. But he never saw this side of David. So it would be even proper and correct if Saul said to David, boy, who are you? But that's not even the question he asks. Three times he asks the question, boy, whose son are you? That's just, why? And again, I think Saul knows who David is, but he's never cared so much about David that he's looked into his history, that he's looked into his family lineage. He just wants to learn more about David. Who taught you this? Who taught you to do that? The question is, boy, whose son are you? And I find that really intriguing. This is how the story ends. And this is how you need to hear. This is the point of the story. The point of the story is this. I am the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite. He doesn't even say his name. At least you would think he would say, I am David, the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite. The story ends with David simply saying, I am the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite. And when I read that, it opened up the story to me, and I've never read this story the same before. I'll tell you why. Every time I've read this story, it's always been a good story. Who doesn't like this story? I don't think I've ever been amazed by the story as much I've been amazed by it now. It's an amazing story. Such an unlikely hero figure. But what's different for me about the story is every time I've heard this story, or even every time I've taught and preached on it, I've always heard it from the perspective of, how can God use you like he used David? Right? What is about David that enabled God to use him? And you might even, people will even be symbolic about it. They say, who or what is the Goliath in your life? And how is God going to overcome that in your life? And I've always kind of heard it taught and preached in that way. And I'm not saying that you can't learn something from David. I think there is, and we may actually look at that next week. But I don't think that's the main point of the story. I think the main point of the story is, I am the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite. I think that's the point of the story. And when I heard that, it opened up the story to me in a way that I've never heard it before. Because this is what I realized. We're doing a series on success, succeeding. Answer the question for me. Did the Israelites succeed in this battle? The answer would be yes, right? They experienced great success. So let me ask you, what did the Israelites do to win this success? What did the Israelites do? What did the men in the army of Israel, what did they do to experience or to get this success? Answer, they did nothing. They did nothing. It's through the act of one person, and it's through the act of one man that the entire people of God are given success. And the reason the Israelites experienced success is because the faith and the actions of one man. And this one man is a shepherd. And he's a shepherd who is a son of a Bethlehemite. That should remind you of another champion in the Bible. There's another champion in the Bible who wins success for the people of God. The Bible tells us that he's a shepherd, that he's a good shepherd, and that he too is the son of a Bethlehemite. The great champion that we're talking about is none other than Jesus Christ. We, the church, we're the people of God. The greatest success that you and I will ever experience is receiving God's salvation. We're even told in the New Testament, what good is it if a man gains the whole world but loses his soul? That's not success. Again, the way God defines success is different than the world defines success. The greatest success that you and I will ever experience is receiving God's salvation. And just like the Israelites in this story who did nothing to earn and to experience their success, we can take no credit for the success that we experience. Our success, our salvation, comes through the act of one man who also is a shepherd, the son of a Bethlehemite. You think this story is great? This may be one of the greatest military victories in all of history. But it is not God's greatest victory. Because this story points forward to God's greatest victory. There are two champions in this story. The first champion is Goliath. We're told that he's the champion. But because David defeated this champion, who is the champion? David is the champion. But David, this son of a Bethlehemite, he points forward to the true champion. This story, it foreshadows the champion, the person of Jesus Christ, through whom we receive our greatest success. There's nothing that we can do. There's nothing that we've done to earn that success. And that's why I've entitled my sermon today, Success Comes from a Champion. It's not what we do. It's not what we've done. Our success, we simply attain it because of the person and the work of Jesus Christ. Would you pray with me as we close today?